October 12th, 1983. A slow, pale dawn crept over the hills of Pine Hollow, West Virginia, painting the wet autumn leaves in dull shades of copper and gold. The rain from the night before still clung to the branches, and every gust of wind sent a soft patter of droplets onto the muddy road below. The air was sharp, almost metallic, tinged with the faint scent of coal smoke drifting from the chimneys of the small mining town. Somewhere in the distance, a chainsaw sputtered to life, its harsh buzz breaking through the muffled quiet of morning. Inside the Pine Hollow Sheriff's Office, Deputy Frank Coulter was sorting through the overnight mail. He was halfway through a stack of bills and grocery flyers when he spotted an envelope that didn't belong. Cream-colored. Edges yellowed with age. His name written in a thin, looping cursive that looked like it belonged to another century. It had no return address, only a Pine Hollow postmark, stamped 2 days earlier. Frank tore the envelope open with a dull letter opener. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, creased and brittle. The handwriting matched the envelope, careful, deliberate. The ink slightly faded. The message was short, and it made the back of his neck prickle. There are bones in the Miller place. More than one ghost sleeps there. If you dig, you'll find them. The paper smelled faintly of mildew and something else, sweet, like old apples left too long in a cellar. Frank leaned back in his chair, the wheels squeaking under his weight. He knew the Miller property well enough, everyone in Pine Hollow did. It sat high on a ridge 2 miles out, just where the paved road gave way to dirt and switchbacks. The farmhouse had been there longer than anyone alive could remember. Its limestone walls were weather-beaten, its shutters hanging loose. A rusted barbed wire fence ran along the edge of the land, and the front gate sagged on one hinge. No one had been seen coming or going from the place in years, though the lights in the upstairs windows sometimes glowed faintly at night. People in town said it was just the wind rattling the glass. Children dared each other to run up the hill and touch the gate, but even the bravest never went further than that. Frank recalled the last time he'd been near the property 6, maybe 7 years ago, responding to a call about a stray dog. The air had felt wrong up there. Too still, no birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the groan of the farmhouse settling on its old beams. He hadn't stayed long. The Miller name itself was almost a ghost in Pine Hollow. Everyone knew of Margaret and Eleanor, the sisters who owned the house, but few had ever spoken to them. They'd stopped coming into town sometime in the late 60s. Before that, they were strange but polite, buying flour and salt at Harlan's general store, never lingering, never making small talk. The stories about them were stranger still, that they came from a cursed bloodline, that their father had been a mason who built the house to keep something in, not out. Frank folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. It was probably a prank, or some local trying to stir trouble, but still. He glanced at the clock. His shift ended at noon. That gave him a few hours to think it over. Maybe drive out there and see for himself. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift from the hollows, curling away in thin white ribbons. The sun, still low, caught the damp grass along the roadside, turning each blade into a spark of gold. But as Frank looked toward the ridge where the Miller house stood barely visible through the morning haze, he felt that same stillness settle over him again, heavy and expectant, somewhere in the pit of his stomach. He knew that if he went up there, he wouldn't just find an empty old house, and whatever he found, it wouldn't be sleeping. The Miller family had not simply appeared in Pine Hollow. They had been carried there by their own stubborn purpose, as if drawn to the ridge by some unseen hand. In the winter of 1899, Solomon Miller arrived from western Pennsylvania with a mule-drawn cart, his pregnant wife, and enough cash to buy 70 acres of land outright. He was a stonemason by trade, and within months he had quarried limestone from the hill behind his new property, cutting and shaping each block himself. The farmhouse he built was sturdy, but strange its windows unusually narrow, the shutters thick and bolted, as though to keep light from escaping. The foundation was deeper than it needed to be, and some swore that the first layer of stone was laid before dawn on the coldest day of the year. Solomon's wife, Clara, gave birth to their first child in early spring, a daughter named Margaret. 2 years later came Eleanor, but the third child, a son, never breathed his first full cry. Clara died during childbirth in 1904, and from that day forward, the Miller home grew quieter. Neighbors remembered Solomon as a hard worker but an odd one. He never joined the men in town at the tavern after a day's labor. He declined offers of help with the harvest, even when it was clear he could use it. Most telling of all, he raised his daughters under rules so strict they bordered on the unnatural. Rule 1, no visitors inside the house. Rule 2, no speaking to strangers, even in town. Rule 3, never be out after sundown. The sisters abided by these rules long after Solomon's death in 1940. By then, Margaret was in her 30s, Eleanor in her late 20s, and their younger brother Isaac, born during the tail end of their father's life, was just 15. Isaac was the only one who ever showed signs of wanting to leave the ridge. Folks saw him at the feed store now and then, lingering at the counter to chat, asking about the bus routes to bigger towns. Then, in the summer of 1951, Isaac vanished. The official story was simple enough: he'd gone to work in Ohio, chasing factory pay. But no one saw him board a bus, no one saw him pack a bag. What some did claim to see was far more unsettling: Isaac walking up the path to the barn one late evening in July, and never walking back down. The sisters kept to themselves more after that. Their trips to town grew rarer, and by the early 1960s they came only in winter, cloaked in heavy shawls and wide-brimmed hats, speaking in clipped sentences, their money passed over the counter with gloved hands. There were whispers, there had always been whispers about the Miller bloodline, that Solomon's parents had been cousins, that the family carried something in their blood they feared would be diluted if they married outside it. An old midwife, long since dead, told her granddaughter she'd once been called to the Miller home for a birth that ended before morning. She claimed the infant had been marked by the curse, though she never said what the mark was. By the mid-1960s, the sisters stopped coming to town entirely. The garden grew wild. The fence lines sagged, but smoke still rose from the chimney in winter, sometimes at night, when the wind was just right. Neighbors swore they could hear singing drifting down from the ridge 2 voices, high and wavering, weaving old hymns in a language no one could place. The town adjusted to their absence. In Pine Hollow, silence was a kind of agreement. If you didn't speak of something, perhaps it wouldn't trouble you. Children grew up daring each other to touch the rusted gate at the end of the overgrown drive. A few claimed they'd seen a pale face peering from the upstairs window, but most dismissed it as imagination. And yet, for those who remembered the Miller family before the world closed in on them, there was an unease that never quite went away, an understanding that the ridge kept its secrets, and that some were buried deeper than stone. The anonymous letter that found its way into Deputy Frank Coulter's hands in October 1983 wasn't the first whisper about the Millers. But it was the first in decades to speak plainly, to name what the town had always refused to bones, and in Pine Hollow, that word had a way of waking the dead. By the time Frank's shift ended at noon, the sky had shifted from pale gray to a dim, pewter overcast. Clouds hung low over Pine Hollow, pressing down on the town like a damp wool blanket. He told himself the drive up to the Miller property was just to satisfy his curiosity, just to check for trespassers. But the truth sat heavier in his chest. He needed to know if the letter was more than a prank. The road to the ridge was little more than a rutted dirt path, the kind that swallowed tires whole after heavy rain. Fallen leaves clung to the mud in slick, flattened patches. As his patrol car crawled upward, the town fell away behind him, replaced by dense stands of oak and maple. The higher he climbed, the quieter it became, until even the hum of the engine seemed out of place. The Miller farmhouse emerged from behind a cluster of black walnut trees. Its limestone walls were streaked with moss, the roof sagging in the middle. The shutters were closed, but one on the second floor hung loose, tapping rhythmically in the breeze. The gate at the end of the drive was chained shut, the rust so deep it flaked away in red dust when he touched it. He called out, his voice carrying strangely in the still air. No answer. Frank circled around to the barn first. Its double doors were warped and splintered, one hanging partially open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and something else, something faintly sweet and rotting. Shafts of light pierced through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes that swirled like drifting ash. Near the back, under a collapsed section of roof, sat an old cot. The mattress had rotted down to springs, the frame eaten by rust. Beside it lay a small pile of animal bones, goat, maybe deer picked clean long ago. It was when Frank rapped on the far wall that he heard it a hollow thud, not solid wood. He set his flashlight between his teeth and pried at the warped boards until one gave way, revealing a crude doorway hidden behind them. Beyond it, a narrow wooden staircase descended into shadow. The steps groaned under his weight as he went down, each creak swallowed by the damp, close air. At the bottom, he found a small dirt-floored chamber bare except for an empty crate, a broken oil lamp, and the lingering smell of wet stone. Whatever had been here once was long gone, but the space felt used, lived in. Back upstairs, he knocked on the farmhouse door. It was chained from the inside. He called out again, identifying himself as law enforcement. A faint shuffling answered him, followed by a dry, wavering voice. "Go away." Frank's stomach tightened. "Margaret Eleanor, it's Deputy Coulter. We've had a concern for your welfare." Silence, then the sound of the chain sliding free. The door opened only part way, revealing a woman's face pale, eyes clouded with cataracts, skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. Her hair hung in white strands, tangled and unwashed. She blinked against the gray daylight, as though it burned her. Inside, the air was close and foul, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and something sour beneath it. The living room was cluttered with stacks of yellowed newspapers, glass jars of cloudy liquid, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Margaret, he assumed it was. Margaret shuffled back into the dim interior, motioning for him to follow. In a corner near the cold fireplace sat another woman, even thinner, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild day. Eleanor. Their hands trembled as they poured weak tea from a dented pot. Their nails were thick and yellowed, their teeth irregular and worn beneath their long sleeves. Frank noticed the unnatural curve of their wrists, the slight bow in their legs. Later, at the county clinic, doctors would confirm what he suspected: severe malnutrition, advanced rickets, cataracts from untreated eye infections, and something more: congenital deformities consistent with several generations of inbreeding. But the strangest discovery came not from the doctors, but from the sisters' own possessions. In a locked desk drawer, behind a faded photograph of 3 children standing stiffly in front of the farmhouse, were letters. Dozens of them. The correspondence was between the sisters and a cousin in Kentucky. The tone was formal. The content chilling, repeated mentions of keeping the line pure, of God's will to preserve the old blood, and a warning to avoid letting the curse spread. Frank closed the drawer slowly, his pulse in his ears. The meaning was still uncertain, but it was clear that whatever secrets the Millers had guarded all these years, they weren't just about family pride, and the worst of them, he suspected, weren't in the house at all. They were under it, Days after the initial search, the county finally granted a full warrant for the Miller property. The sisters, Margaret and Eleanor, were already under heavy sedation at the state hospital, refusing to speak, eating only when coaxed. The doctors reported they barely reacted to questions, as if their minds were elsewhere, perhaps still on the ridge, guarding whatever secrets it held. The morning of the search was bitter. A thin crust of frost clung to every blade of grass, glittering faintly under the dull, iron-colored sky. The air carried the metallic tang of frozen soil, and the wind that cut across the ridge seemed to whistle through the trees with a warning. Frank Coulter led the team, 2 deputies, a county coroner, and Ruth Daly, the county archivist who'd insisted on coming after hearing of the strange markings found on the property. They began behind the barn. It was there, beneath a collapsed chicken coop matted with decades of leaf rot, that they found a narrow wooden door, sunk halfway into the ground. The hinges were almost eaten away by rust, the lock swollen with corrosion. One squeeze of the bolt cutters and it fell apart in Frank's hands. When they pulled the door open, a gust of air seeped out, heavy and stale, carrying with it a layered scent, damp earth, mold, and the faint coppery note of old blood. The first flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing a low-ceilinged stone chamber, roughly 20 feet across. The walls were built from the same limestone as the farmhouse. But here the mortar was crumbling, streaked with moisture. The floor was packed dirt, uneven underfoot. Against the far wall stood a crude altar stacked limestone slabs blackened by years of soot. Scratched into its face were crude symbols, crooked lines intersecting circles, an eye shape cut so deep it cast its own shadow. Ruth knelt before it, running her gloved fingers over the carvings. Appalachian folk signs, she whispered, mixed with old Germanic charms, meant to ward off sickness or keep something contained. Atop the altar was a bundle wrapped in burlap, the fabric dark in places where moisture had eaten through. Frank hesitated, then pulled it open. Bones, small, delicate, a child's. The skull was no larger than his palm, the jawbone fragile as a bird's. A second bundle lay underneath, smaller still. The burlap tore apart easily, and what slid into the light made the coroner suck in a sharp breath, a tiny ribcage. The bones barely fused. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the wind above seemed to stop, as though the ridge itself was listening. In the corner of the room sat a tin trunk. Frank opened it to find children's toys, a wooden horse, a rag doll missing an arm, a ball of stitched leather, each worn soft from handling. Every toy bore a thin strip of paper tied to it, with a date written in the same thin cursive as the anonymous letter. The earliest was marked 1910, the most recent 1974. The letters from the sister's desk drawer came back to him now with terrible clarity, the talk of keeping the line pure, avoiding the curse. It wasn't abstract superstition. It was a plan, a tradition. Ruth stood, her expression unreadable. They believed the bloodline carried a flaw, she said softly, and to them, a child born weak wasn't meant to live. This altar, it's both a burial site and a ritual, mercy, in their eyes. Murder, in ours. The family Bible was found on a shelf beside the altar. Its cover was warped from moisture. But when Frank flipped it open, he realized the center had been hollowed out like a box. Inside lay an envelope, the paper brittle, edges curling. The letter within was short, the handwriting trembling. "We do what must be done, as Father did before us, and his father before him. The curse lies in the blood, and the weak ones must not suffer. Better to send them to God's hands than leave them to wander in shame. We have kept the ridge clean. We have kept the line pure. M. Miller. E. Miller." Frank's stomach turned. This wasn't some sudden descent into madness. This was deliberate, methodical. A practice passed down like a family recipe, only here, The ingredients were flesh and blood. While the others cataloged the altar and bundles, Frank noticed a narrow slit in the far wall. It looked like a fault in the stonework, but when he pressed on it, the rock shifted, revealing a cramped passage. They squeezed through, their flashlight slicing through the black until the space widened into another chamber. Here, the air was colder, the damp smell sharper. 6 shallow pits lined the floor. 3 were filled and packed down. 3 were still open, the soil loose and waiting. The coroner's voice cracked as she spoke. They had room for more. When they finally emerged into the daylight, it was late afternoon. Frost had thickened in the shadows, and the ridge seemed darker, the trees crowding closer around the path as if to hide what had been uncovered. Frank didn't look back at the farmhouse. He didn't want to see that upstairs window, because if he did, he wasn't sure he'd believe it was empty. The county sheriff's office sealed off the Miller property that same night, posting deputies at the gate until a demolition crew could be scheduled. But the news had already bled into Pine Hollow's veins. By morning, word was spreading through the diner, the feed store, the church steps spoken in low voices, broken by uneasy glances toward the ridge. No one had yet said the words murder or infanticide aloud, but everyone knew that's what the bones meant. Legally, the case was a problem from the start. The Miller sisters, now in their 70s, had been declared mentally incompetent after a week of psychiatric evaluations. Doctors reported severe cognitive decline. Margaret spoke only in fragments, repeating the same lines from the Bible over and over, while Eleanor stared at the walls for hours, humming in a thin, high voice. Neither seemed aware they were no longer in their home. The district attorney announced there would be no criminal trial. "We can't prosecute someone who doesn't understand the charges," he said at a press conference. "Justice here will have to take another form." That statement sat badly with many in town. Justice, to Pine Hollow, meant seeing someone answer for what had been done and without a trial. There would be no answers at all. The state hospital placed the sisters in adjoining rooms, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps to keep them calm. Nurses reported that they would sometimes hold hands in the dark, whispering to each other in a dialect no one recognized. In late January of 1984, Eleanor died quietly in her sleep. Margaret followed less than 3 weeks later. The hospital chaplain said he'd never seen someone look so ready to leave this world. After their deaths, the county moved quickly. The farmhouse was emptied, its furniture hauled to the landfill. The barn was torn down plank by plank, but the basement, that place under the ridge where the altar stood, was different. Officials decided it was too dangerous to leave standing, but no one wanted to work in it. Finally, the sheriff ordered it filled with concrete before the demolition crew set fire to what remained. From the road, you'd never know the Miller place had been there. Grass grew over the charred foundation within a year. By the late 80s, young maples had begun to sprout. But to those who'd walked inside, who'd breathed that cold, heavy air, the ridge was not empty. It had simply covered its shame. The County Historical Society took custody of the letters, the family Bible, and the contents of the tin trunk. They were placed in an archive box labeled restricted and locked away in the basement of the library. Officially, the restriction was to protect sensitive historical material from damage. Unofficially, it was because no one wanted the story revived. Pine Hollow needed to move on, to bury the past as completely as the Millers had buried their dead. Still, stories have a way of leaking through cracks. Hikers who wandered too far off the ridge trail claimed they heard singing 2 voices, faint but clear, weaving a hymn in words they couldn't place. Deer hunters said their dogs would whine and refused to go near the old gate post, even though nothing stood beyond it now but weeds and trees. And then there were the rumors about Isaac Miller, the brother who'd vanished in 1951. Some swore he'd run from the ridge and started a family in the next county. Others whispered that he'd been one of the first to be sent to God's hands, and that his grave was somewhere under the old barn floor. A few of the older residents still muttered about the curse the Millers believed in, that it wasn't just in their heads, that it was real, and it would find its way into the blood of anyone who carried their line, whether Isaac escaped it or carried it with him. No one could agree. Frank Coulter stayed on the force for another 10 years, but he never spoke publicly about what he'd found under that barn. In private, he admitted to Ruth Daly that he sometimes dreamed of the ridge standing at the bottom of those stone steps, feeling the air grow colder with each breath, knowing something waited just out of sight. He always woke before he reached the altar. By the late 90s, most of the town's oldest witnesses were gone, and the Miller sisters became more legend than memory. New families moved in, never told the full story. The ridge became just another line of trees on the horizon. But for those who remember, there's an unspoken understanding you don't go up there after dark. And if you hear singing in the wind, you keep walking. Because some legacies are not just cursed, they are patient. They wait. And in Pine Hollow, the past has a way of finding its way home. So, now, I'll ask you if you found an envelope on your doorstep tomorrow, written in an old hand, warning you about the place at the edge of town. Would you open it, or would you burn it before the words could take root? Because once you know, you can't unknow, and some bones never stay buried.